I found the photograph inside a wall that shouldn't have been opened. The house was mine by inheritance, a narrow Victorian in Salem, Massachusetts, that had belonged to my great-aunt Miriam. She'd lived there alone for 60 years, never married, never had visitors that anyone could remember. When she died at 93, the property passed to me, her only living relative who'd bothered to visit more than twice. I'd planned to sell it. The real estate agent said it needed work but had good bones. That phrase people use when they mean a house is structurally sound but cosmetically depressing. The wallpaper was ancient, the floors creaked with every step, and there was a persistent smell of old roses that no amount of bleach could eliminate. The contractor, a man named Davis with paint-splattered jeans and skeptical eyes, started work on a Tuesday in October. He was updating the wiring in the second-floor study when he called me upstairs. "You need to see this," he said, gesturing to a section of wall he'd removed. Behind the plaster and lath, in a hollow space that shouldn't have existed, was a frame, large, ornate, wrapped in what looked like silk cloth that had rotted to threads. Davis carefully extracted it while I held my breath, afraid it would crumble. When we laid it on the desk and pulled away the remaining fabric, I saw the photograph. It was massive, nearly 2 feet wide, mounted on thick cardboard that had yellowed to the color of old bone. The image itself was pristine, as if the wall had preserved it perfectly, protecting it from light and air for over a century. A family portrait. 16 people arranged in 3 rows, posed in what must have been a formal parlor. The date, embossed in faded gold at the bottom corner, read, September 1907. Everything about the composition followed the conventions of the era. The subjects wore their finest clothes. High-collared dresses with elaborate embroidery, dark suits with stiff postures, expressions carefully neutral for the long exposure. A decorative backdrop hung behind them, painted curtains and ornamental details. Above the back row, a framed portrait of what looked like a military figure hung on the wall, watching over the gathering. But something about the image felt profoundly wrong. I couldn't explain it at first. The people looked normal enough, men and women ranging from young adults to middle-aged, their faces showing the usual range of Edwardian severity. Some stood, some sat. Some positioned themselves at the edges of the frame, as if reluctant to be fully present. Yet their eyes held something I'd never seen in old photographs before. Not the blankness of long exposure, not the discomfort of sitting still for the camera. Something else. Something that looked like knowledge. Like they knew exactly what was about to happen to them. Davis was watching my face. Creepy, right? Why do you think someone sealed it in the wall? I don't know, I said quietly, unable to look away from those 16 faces. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. I'd brought it downstairs and propped it against the fireplace mantel, intending to research it the next day. But as evening fell and shadows gathered in the corners of the room, I found myself studying it obsessively. The longer I looked, the more details emerged. Small things, easily missed at first glance. The woman in the back row, second from left, had her hand positioned oddly against her chest, fingers splayed as if clutching something beneath her dress. The man beside her wasn't quite looking at the camera. His gaze was directed slightly to the right, toward something outside the frame. In the middle row, a younger woman sat with her hands folded in her lap, but her left hand appeared to be gripping her right wrist so tightly that the tendons stood out even in the old photograph. Beside her, a man with a mustache had his mouth slightly open, caught mid-breath, as if he'd been about to speak when the shutter clicked. And in the front row, the two women sitting on the floor seemed to be leaning away from each other, though their formal poses tried to hide it. One held what looked like a small book. The other's hands were empty, but there was a dark stain on her sleeve that could have been shadow, or could have been something else. But it was the portrait on the wall behind them that disturbed me most. The military figure in the frame wasn't looking at the artist who'd painted him. He was looking down at the family, his expression severe, almost accusatory. And in the photograph's grain, enhanced by time and shadow, his painted eyes seemed to follow wherever I moved in the room. I told myself I was being irrational. Old photographs often looked eerie. It was the lighting, the long exposures, the unfamiliar faces frozen in time. There was nothing supernatural about feeling unsettled by the past. But when I went to bed that night, I left all the lights on. The next morning, I photographed the portrait with my phone and started searching. The frame had no photographer's mark, no studio name embossed on the mount, but the image quality suggested a professional, someone with expensive equipment and experience in formal portraiture. In 1907, that meant an established studio, probably local to Salem. I started with the Salem Historical Society. The archivist, a woman named Patricia, with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain, seemed intrigued when I showed her the photograph. "I've never seen this image before," she said, adjusting her glasses. "But the clothing and styling suggest it's definitely from the Edwardian period, probably 1905 to 1910. The quality indicates a high-end studio. There were 3 in Salem at that time: Blackwell & Sons, the Mariner Studio, and Hutchinson's on Essex Street. Could you help me identify the people?" She studied the faces carefully. "Possibly. If they were prominent families, we'd have records, but—" She paused, her expression shifting. "There's something odd about this photograph. The way they're arranged, the formal nature of it. This looks like a commemorative portrait, the kind families would commission for special occasions. Weddings, anniversaries, reunions. Or funerals," I said quietly. Patricia looked at me sharply. "Yes, or memorial services, though typically those would show just the deceased or their immediate family, not—" She counted silently. "Not 16 people." She promised to search the archives and contact me if she found anything. I left the Historical Society with a growing sense of unease. That afternoon, I went through my great-aunt Miriam's papers, looking for any mention of the photograph or the family it depicted. Most of her documents were mundane: utility bills, correspondence with lawyers, receipts from the local market. But in a box labeled Family History, I found a journal. The leather was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. Miriam's handwriting filled the first 30 pages or so, neat and careful, dated from 1968. Most entries were brief, recording weather and daily activities, but one entry from October 23rd, 1968, made me stop cold. Found the photograph again today. I thought I destroyed it 20 years ago, burned it in the fireplace until nothing remained but ash. Yet there it was, in the upstairs closet, pristine and whole, as if it had never been touched by flame. I can't explain it. I've tried to be rational, to tell myself I'm misremembering, that I burned a different photograph. But I know what I saw. I watched it blacken and curl. I watched the faces disappear into char. It came back. This time, I'm sealing it in the wall. Perhaps if I can't see it, if no one can see it, it will finally let me rest. Perhaps they'll all finally rest. God forgive me for what happened in this house. My hands trembled as I read those words. What had happened? What could have driven my great-aunt to seal a family photograph in the wall? I flipped through the remaining pages, but there were no more entries. The rest of the journal was blank, as if Miriam had stopped writing the moment she sealed that photograph away. Patricia called me 3 days later, her voice tight with something between excitement and apprehension. "I found them," she said. "Can you come to the Historical Society? There's something you need to see." The archive room was cooler than I remembered, the air conditioning running despite the autumn chill outside. Patricia had spread documents across a research table: newspaper clippings, census records, property deeds, and a leather-bound ledger that looked older than the photograph itself. "The Whitmore family," she said, pointing to a census record from 1900. "They purchased your house in 1883. 17 people lived there at various times. 3 generations, some extended family. A few distant relatives who came to stay during financial hardship." She spread out the newspaper clippings. They were from the Salem Evening News, dated October through December 1907. The first headline read, "Tragedy Strikes Prominent Salem Family." "It started with a fire," Patricia explained. "Small, contained to the kitchen. 1 death, Martha Whitmore, the matriarch. The family claimed it was an accident, a knocked-over lamp, but there were rumors." She showed me the next article. "Second death in Whitmore House. Raises questions." 2 weeks later, the eldest son, Thomas, was found dead in the study. The official cause was heart failure, but he was only 42 and had been in perfect health. The clippings continued, each one more disturbing than the last. By December 1907, all 16 members of the Whitmore family were dead. The final article was brief, almost dismissive. "Whitmore property sold after tragic year." The house at 47 Essex Street, site of 16 deaths over the past 3 months, has been sold to new owners. Police have concluded their investigation, finding no evidence of foul play. The deaths have been attributed to a series of unfortunate natural causes, though speculation persists among Salem residents. I stared at the newspaper, my mind racing. 16 deaths in 3 months. Patricia nodded grimly. "And here's the part that will interest you. I found the photographer's mark." She pulled out a magnifying glass and showed me the bottom corner of my photograph, where I could now see faint letters embossed in the cardboard. "H&S Photography, Salem Hutchinsons," she said. "I found their business ledger. They kept detailed records of every commission." She opened the leather-bound book to a marked page. "September 12th, 1907. Family portrait, 16 subjects, Whitmore residence. Rush order, double fee paid." "Rush order? Why?" "The ledger doesn't say, but look at the notation next to it." She pointed to handwriting in the margin, smaller and hastier than the official entries. "Client requested multiple copies. Seemed urgent. Family appeared distressed during sitting. Note, this is the last photograph. The last photograph." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "They knew." "It appears so," Patricia said quietly. "Though whether they knew what was coming or were documenting something that had already begun, I can't say. But there's one more thing." She pulled out a final document. A property deed from 1908. After the Whitmores all died, the house was sold to a family named Harrison. They lived there for 2 years before leaving suddenly. No explanation in the records. The house changed hands 6 more times between 1910 and 1948. No family stayed longer than 3 years. And then? Then your great-aunt Miriam purchased it in 1948. She lived there for 60 years. Patricia's expression was troubled. She was the only person who stayed. I have to wonder why. That night, I laid out all the information on my dining room table. The photograph in the center, surrounded by newspaper clippings and notes, like evidence at a crime scene. I studied the 16 faces again, now knowing their names. Back row, left to right. Martha Whitmore, the matriarch who died first in the kitchen fire. Thomas Whitmore, the eldest son who died of sudden heart failure. Sarah Whitmore, Thomas's wife. James Whitmore, the second son. Clara Whitmore, James's wife. Robert Whitmore, the youngest son. Elizabeth Whitmore, Robert's wife. Henry Whitmore, Martha's brother. Middle row, Margaret Harrison, Martha's sister. John Harrison, Margaret's husband. Catherine Whitmore, Martha's daughter. Samuel Whitmore, Catherine's husband. Grace Whitmore, unmarried daughter. Front row, Rebecca Whitmore, granddaughter, age 19. Emily Whitmore, granddaughter, age 17. And behind them, on the wall, the portrait. I still didn't know who that military figure was, but his painted gaze seemed even more accusing now that I knew what happened to the family he watched over. I began cross-referencing the newspaper articles with the photograph, trying to identify who died when. The deaths hadn't been random. Martha died first, in the kitchen fire. In the photograph, she stood in the back row with her hand against her chest. Exactly where? According to the coroner's report, she'd suffered fatal burns. Thomas died 2 weeks later, heart failure in the study. In the photograph, his face was unusually pale, his lips slightly parted, as if gasping for breath. Catherine died in her sleep. In the photograph, her eyes had a distant, dreamy quality, as if she was already half gone. One by one, I traced the pattern. Each death matched something visible in the photograph. A subtle sign, a small detail that took on sinister meaning in hindsight. The stain on Rebecca's sleeve matched the poison that killed her. The way James gripped his collar matched the description of his choking death. Elizabeth's bent neck matched her fatal fall down the stairs. It was as if the photograph had documented not just who they were, but how they would die. I sat back, my heart pounding. This was impossible. Photographs didn't predict death. They captured moments, nothing more. But then I remembered Miriam's journal entry. She'd tried to destroy this photograph, watched it burn, and it had come back. I looked at the portrait propped against my fireplace mantel, 16 faces staring out at me from 1907, and I realized something that made my blood run cold. In old photographs, people's eyes always looked unfocused, distant because of the long exposure times. But in this portrait, every single pair of eyes was focused, sharp, looking directly at the camera, looking directly at whoever was viewing the photograph, at me. I started noticing things after that. Small things at first. The smell of roses grew stronger, particularly near the photograph. I'd find doors open that I'd closed, lights on in rooms I hadn't entered. The temperature would drop suddenly, without explanation, leaving frost patterns on windows despite the mild autumn weather. Then the sounds began. Footsteps in the upstairs hallway, multiple sets, walking in procession. Voices, distant and indistinct, like conversation from another room. Once, I heard laughter, bright and genuine, and completely wrong for a house where 16 people had died. I told myself it was old house sounds, settling foundations, pipes expanding and contracting, wind in the eaves. Every Victorian had its creaks and groans. But I couldn't explain the photograph itself. It had started changing. The first time I noticed, I thought I was imagining it. The woman in the back row, Martha, seemed to be looking slightly to the left instead of straight ahead. I compared it to the photo on my phone, taken that first day. In the original, she'd been looking at the camera. Now she wasn't. Over the next week, more changes appeared. Thomas's mouth closed, as if he'd finished whatever he'd been trying to say. Catherine's hands unclenched from her lap. The military portrait in the background seemed to hang at a different angle. And the two women in the front row, Rebecca and Emily, appeared to have moved closer together. I measured the photograph obsessively, looking for signs of warping or distortion. The cardboard mount was perfectly flat. The image surface showed no cracks or damage. Yet the faces continued to shift, so subtly I could only detect it by comparison to earlier photos. They were moving, not dramatically, not obviously enough to be called motion, but changing position incrementally, millimeter by millimeter, as if whatever was captured in that photograph was still alive, still aware, still able to act despite being frozen in silver nitrate for over a century. I called Patricia at the Historical Society, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "Is there anything else in the records? Anything about the photograph specifically?" She was quiet for a long moment. "There is one thing. I found a police interview with the photographer, Mr. Hutchinson. It's dated December 1907, after all the deaths. He said something strange." "What?" "He claimed the family had commissioned the portrait because they believed they were cursed. Martha Whitmore had told him they needed a record of everyone together before it was too late. She'd said..." Patricia's voice dropped. "She'd said they'd disturbed something in the house, that they'd done something unforgivable, and now they were being punished for it." "What did they do?" The interview doesn't say, but Hutchinson mentioned one more thing. He said that when he developed the plates, there was an additional figure in the photograph, a 17th person standing behind the family. But when he printed the final copies, the figure was gone. He thought it was a developing error until he checked the negative. The figure was still there, but so faint it didn't transfer to the prints. My mouth went dry. Did he describe this figure? Only that it appeared to be watching the family, and that its expression was... She paused. He used the word triumphant. That night, I examined the photograph under different lights. Natural, artificial, UV. I used magnifying glasses, took high-resolution scans, adjusted the contrast and brightness on my computer. And there, in the shadows behind the back row, I saw it. A 17th figure, so faint it was almost invisible, blending with the painted backdrop and the dark curtains. But once I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. A shape that suggested a human form, standing directly behind Martha Whitmore, hands outstretched as if about to grasp her shoulders. No face was visible, just a suggestion of where a head might be. But the posture was clear. This figure was leaning forward, looming over the family like a shadow given weight. I cross-referenced this with the portrait on the wall behind the family. The military figure, the one whose eyes seemed to follow viewers. I zoomed in on my digital scan, enhancing the details until I could see the painted features clearly. The face was gaunt, severe, with deep-set eyes and a thin mouth set in a hard line. The uniform was Confederate. I recognized the gray and the insignia. A captain, perhaps, or a colonel. And on the frame of his portrait, too small to read without enhancement, was an engraved nameplate. Captain Josiah Whitmore, 1832-1863. Josiah Whitmore. I searched for him in the Historical Society's database. Patricia sent me files within the hour. Captain Josiah Whitmore had been a Confederate officer who died at Gettysburg. His body had been returned to Salem, his family's hometown, and buried in the cemetery on Charter Street. The Whitmore family had built their fortune on shipping, but Josiah had been the black sheep, choosing military service over commerce. According to family letters preserved in the archive, Josiah had been cruel and violent, with a temper that terrified even his fellow soldiers. After his death, his wife had burned all his personal effects except for his commissioned portrait, which she'd hung in the parlor as a memorial. That portrait had hung in the Whitmore house for 44 years before the photograph was taken. And there was one more detail, mentioned in a letter from Martha Whitmore to her sister in 1906. We've decided to renovate the parlor. The work begins next week. We'll be removing the old wainscoting and replacing the floor. I know some in the family object to disturbing Josiah's wall, but the room is badly in need of repair. His portrait will be temporarily relocated to the study. I confess I'll be glad to see it gone. I've never liked how he watches us from that wall, as if judging everything we do. Perhaps with him in storage during the renovation, the house will feel lighter. The renovation would have occurred in early 1907. The photograph was taken in September 1907. The deaths began in October 1907. I sat back, understanding crystallizing with cold clarity. The family had disturbed something during the renovation. Not Josiah's portrait. That was just paint and canvas. But something else. Something that had been sealed in the walls or under the floors. Something that had been deliberately hidden decades before. And when they broke those seals, they released it. The next morning, I called Davis, the contractor. I need you to check something. The study, where you found the photograph. I need to know what else was sealed in that wall. He arrived that afternoon with a sledgehammer and a puzzled expression. We went to the second-floor study, the room where Thomas Whitmore had died of heart failure in 1907. The room where my great-aunt had sealed the photograph in 1968. Davis removed the remaining plaster carefully, exposing the wall cavity where the photograph had been hidden. As he cleared away debris, something else emerged. A box, small, wooden, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth that had rotted away in places. He lifted it out carefully and set it on the floor. We both stared at it for a long moment before I knelt and opened the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon that had turned to gray dust. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. I lifted out the first bundle carefully. The letters were addressed to Josiah Whitmore, sent to him at various Confederate camps between 1861 and 1863. All were from the same person, his wife, Abigail. I began reading, and the horror of what I discovered made my hands shake. Abigail's letters started normally enough. News from home, expressions of concern for Josiah's safety, wishes for his swift return. But as the war dragged on and Josiah's responses grew sparse and violent, the tone changed. She wrote of his rages before he left, of the bruises she hid beneath long sleeves. She wrote of her fear, her desperate prayers that he would die honorably in battle so she wouldn't have to face his return. She wrote of discovering she was pregnant and knowing she couldn't bring a child into a house where Josiah would rule. And then, in a letter dated February 1863, she wrote of what she'd done. My dear husband, by the time you read this letter, should you ever return to read it, I will have made a choice that condemns my soul. I cannot continue to live in fear. I cannot bring our child into your darkness. I have taken measures to ensure your spirit can never return to this house. I have consulted with those who understand such things. Your portrait hangs in the parlor, as you requested, but beneath the floor where it stands, I have placed items that will bind you to this realm, but separate you from this world. You will watch, but you will never touch. You will see, but you will never act. If you die in battle, as I pray you will not find rest. You will not find peace. You will remain trapped between this world and the next, forever bound to the house you terrorized, but unable to harm those within it. I know this is witchcraft. I know I risk eternal damnation. But I would rather burn in hell than watch you raise our child with the same cruelty you showed me. I am not sorry. Abigail Josiah did die in battle at Gettysburg in July 1863. His body was returned to Salem and buried. Abigail lived another 30 years, raised their daughter alone, and never remarried. And the portrait remained on the wall, watching over a family that didn't know what had been sealed beneath their feet. Until the renovation in 1907, when they tore up the floor and broke the binding. I spent that night reading through the rest of the documents Davis and I found in the wall. Along with Abigail's letters were other items. A journal in her handwriting, detailing the ritual she'd performed. A list of materials buried beneath the parlor floor. And a final letter, addressed to her daughter Martha, the same Martha who would become the family matriarch and die first in 1907. My dearest Martha, you must never disturb the parlor floor. I have bound something there, something dark and vengeful that would destroy our family if released. Your father's spirit is trapped, unable to rest, unable to harm. But if the seal is broken, he will be free to act in ways I cannot predict. He was a cruel man in life. I believe he will be crueler in death. Promise me you will protect this house. Promise me you will never allow the floor to be disturbed. Your loving mother. But Martha never received that letter. According to the dates on the documents, Abigail died suddenly in 1893, and her papers were sealed in this wall by someone else, perhaps a servant who understood their importance but not their content. Martha, not knowing the danger, ordered renovations 14 years later, and Josiah, trapped for 44 years, finally broke free. I looked at the photograph again, understanding now what I was seeing. The family gathered for one last portrait because they knew they were dying. They'd felt it in the weeks after the renovation, the cold spots, the shadows that moved independently, the feeling of being watched by something that wished them harm. Martha had commissioned the photograph as a memorial, a record of who they were before Josiah took them all. And in that photograph, captured by accident or intention or something darker, was proof. The faint figure standing behind them, hands outstretched, ready to claim what he believed was his. The family he'd terrorized in life, now his to destroy in death. I should have burned everything right then. The photograph, the letters, the journal. I should have torn down the house if necessary, salted the earth, and never looked back. But I didn't. Because I'd begun to notice something else about the photograph, something that connected it not just to the Whitmore family, but to everyone who'd lived in this house since. I went back through the property records Patricia had sent me. 6 families between 1908 and 1948, none staying longer than 3 years. I found obituaries for members of each family. All died young. All died in the house or shortly after leaving it. Heart attacks, accidents, sudden illnesses that doctors couldn't explain. And then Miriam, who lived here for 60 years and died at 93. The only person who survived. I found more of her journals in the attic, dozens of them, dating back to 1948. She'd been documenting everything, every cold spot, every shadow, every moment when she felt Josiah's presence. But unlike the other families, she hadn't run. She'd fought back. In a journal from 1952, she wrote, "I've discovered the key to surviving in this house. Josiah is bound to the portrait and the photograph. As long as they remain sealed, separated from each other, his power is limited. The portrait must never see the photograph, and the photograph must never see the light of the place where the portrait hung. I've burned the portrait 3 times now. I've reduced it to ash. Each time it returns, somewhere in the house, the attic, the basement, hidden in a closet. I cannot destroy it permanently, but I've learned to recognize when it returns, and I've learned to hide it again before it can do harm. As for the photograph, I've tried to destroy it as well, but like the portrait, it cannot be unmade. So I've sealed it in the wall where no one will find it, where it cannot watch and influence and corrupt. As long as they remain separate, I can live here. As long as I remain vigilant, I can keep Josiah contained. But I worry about what will happen after I die. Who will guard this house then? Who will keep the portrait and the photograph apart?" I lowered the journal, my heart pounding. The portrait. I'd been so focused on the photograph that I hadn't thought about the portrait. But it had been in the photograph, hanging on the wall behind the family. And if Miriam was right, if both objects carried Josiah's curse, then... I stood abruptly and began searching the house. I found it in the basement, behind the old furnace, wrapped in a blanket. Captain Josiah Whitmore stared out at me from the canvas, his painted eyes sharp and malevolent. The portrait was smaller than I'd expected. Maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, the frame ornate but tarnished. Someone, Miriam, I assumed, had scratched symbols into the back of the canvas, sigils that looked like protection marks, but the marks had faded. And now that the photograph was out of the wall, now that both objects were in the same house again, the binding was breaking. That night, I woke to find all 16 members of the Whitmore family standing at the foot of my bed. They weren't solid. I could see through them, see the wall behind their translucent forms. But they were there, arranged exactly as they'd been in the photograph. Martha in the back row, her hand pressed to her chest where she'd burned. Thomas beside her, his face pale and gasping. All of them staring at me with those 2 focused eyes. And behind them, barely visible, but unmistakable, was Josiah. His form was darker than theirs, more substantial. While the family appeared as pale impressions, he looked almost solid. And his expression, I'd thought the portrait showed cruelty. But the ghost wore something worse. Satisfaction. Triumph. The look of someone who'd waited a very long time and was finally getting what he wanted. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by whatever force was holding the Whitmore family between this world and the next. Martha's lips moved. No sound, but I could read the words. Help us. And then they were gone. I lay in the darkness, shaking, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I finally managed to move, I grabbed my phone and called the only person I could think of who might understand. Patricia answered on the fourth ring, her voice heavy with sleep. "It's 2 a.m. "They're here," I said. "The Whitmores. I saw them. And Josiah." "Slow down. What happened?" I explained everything. The portrait, the letters, what I'd learned about the binding and Miriam's journals. When I finished, there was a long silence. "You need to separate them again," Patricia finally said. "The portrait and the photograph. Put as much distance between them as possible." "Miriam tried that. They keep coming back." "Then you need to do what Abigail did. Rebind him, but permanently this time." "I don't know how." "I think I do." Patricia's voice grew firmer. "The Historical Society has a collection of occult materials from the Salem witch trials and the spiritualist movement. There are records of binding rituals, ways to trap malevolent spirits. If you can get here tomorrow, I'll have everything ready." I agreed, though I knew I wouldn't sleep the rest of that night. As dawn broke, I went downstairs to check on the photograph. It was gone. The spot where I'd left it propped against the fireplace was empty. I searched the entire first floor, then the second, then the basement. Nothing. And the portrait I'd found behind the furnace, was now hanging in the study. On the exact wall where it had hung in 1907, before the renovations began. Directly above the spot where Abigail had buried her binding materials over 140 years ago. Patricia met me at the Historical Society at dawn, her arms full of old books and loose papers. We went to the archive room, where she'd laid out everything she'd found. Journals from alleged witches executed in Salem. Records from 19th century spiritualist circles. Handwritten grimoires donated by families who wanted nothing to do with their ancestors' practices. And most importantly, a leather-bound book dated 1862, belonging to a woman named Margaret Hale, the same woman Abigail's journal had mentioned consulting about Josiah. "It's all here," Patricia said, opening the book to marked pages. "Instructions for spirit binding. It requires items connected to the person in life, items that can anchor their spirit to a specific location." "The portrait." "Exactly. And the photograph. That's the anchor for the family. Josiah is tied to his portrait, and the Whitmores are tied to their photograph. As long as both exist in the same space, he can use their connection to manifest. He's feeding on their trapped spirits. So how do we stop him?" Patricia showed me a page filled with dense handwriting and crude diagrams. "We need to separate them permanently. Create a barrier he can't cross. Salt, iron, and specific words of binding. But," she looked at me seriously, "this ritual requires you to confront him directly. You have to command him to release them while standing in the space where he's strongest." "The study?" "Yes." I felt cold fear settle in my stomach. But I also thought about those 16 faces, trapped for over a century, used as fuel for Josiah's malevolence. If I didn't do this, they'd remain that way forever. And anyone else who lived in that house would suffer the same fate. I returned to the house at noon, carrying a bag of supplies Patricia had given me. Salt, iron nails, white candles, and pages copied from Margaret Hale's grimoire. The house felt different, colder. The air pressed down with a weight that made breathing difficult. The smell of roses had been replaced by something else. Charred wood, old smoke, the metallic tang of blood. I climbed the stairs to the study. The portrait hung on the wall exactly where it had been in the 1907 photograph. Josiah's painted eyes following my every movement. Below it, on the desk, lay the photograph. Returned. Waiting. I laid out the materials according to Patricia's instructions. A circle of salt around the desk, iron nails at the 4 cardinal points, white candles at each corner of the room. The grimoire pages spread before me. The words of the binding ritual written in Margaret Hale's careful hand. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. My breath became visible. Clouds of vapor in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. The candles flickered despite the still air. And in the photograph on the desk, the 16 faces began to move. Not subtly this time. Not the gradual shifts I'd noticed before. They turned their heads all at once and looked directly at me. Their mouths opened in silent screams. I began reading the ritual, my voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. Latin phrases that Patricia had translated for me. Commands that felt heavy on my tongue, weighted with power I didn't understand, but could feel thrumming through the air. Josiah Whitmore, I bind you to this place. I bind you to the portrait that bears your image. I bind you to the darkness that claimed your soul. The room shuddered. The portrait on the wall began to vibrate, the frame rattling against the plaster. And then he appeared. Not translucent like the Whitmore family had been. Solid, real. Standing between me and the desk, his Confederate uniform as gray and crisp as the day he'd died at Gettysburg. His face matched the portrait exactly. Gaunt, severe, eyes like chips of ice that held nothing but rage. "You have no authority here," he said, and his voice was like wind through a graveyard. "This house is mine. These souls are mine. Everything within these walls belongs to me." I forced myself to continue reading, to ignore the terror that screamed at me to run. "I command you to release them. Release the family you destroyed. Release every soul you've claimed in this house." Josiah smiled, and it was the cruelest expression I'd ever seen. They came to me willingly. They disturbed my rest. They broke the binding that faithless woman placed upon me. They deserve their fate. "They didn't know," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Martha didn't know about Abigail's binding. She was trying to make the house better, not... She should have known." The temperature plummeted further. Frost spread across the windows in crystalline patterns. She should have left well enough alone. But she had to renovate, had to improve, had to tear up the floors where Abigail thought she could trap me forever. He moved closer, and I could smell him now. Gunpowder and decay, the scent of battlefields and buried rage. Abigail thought she was clever, thought her little witch friend could bind me with salt and iron, and words stolen from old books. But all she did was trap me between worlds, forced to watch as my family lived and laughed and forgot me. 44 years of watching, 44 years of being unable to touch, unable to act, unable to claim what was rightfully mine. "The house was never yours," I said, gripping the grimoire pages so tightly they crumpled. "You terrorized Abigail. You would have terrorized your daughter. You don't deserve peace or rest or... I deserve revenge." His roar shook the house. Pictures fell from walls. glass cracked in the window frames. And I will have it. Every soul that enters this house, every person who dares to claim what is mine. They will all join my collection, trapped in that photograph forever, feeding my existence, sustaining me through eternity. I looked at the photograph on the desk. The 16 faces were still moving, still screaming silently, but now I could see them more clearly, see the agony in their expressions, see how thin they'd become, how faded, as if Josiah had been slowly consuming them for over a century. "No," I said quietly. Then louder, "No, I won't let you." I grabbed the iron nails and drove them into the 4 corners of the photograph's cardboard mount, pinning it to the desk. Josiah screamed, a sound of such fury and pain that my ears rang. The salt circle began to glow faintly, the white light spreading outward. "By iron, I bind you. By salt, I purify this space. By the words of those who came before, I command you to release your hold." "You cannot bind me!" Josiah lunged forward, but the salt circle stopped him as surely as a wall. His hands pressed against the invisible barrier, and where they touched, the air rippled and burned. "That photograph is my anchor. The portrait is my vessel. You cannot separate us without destroying them, and you cannot destroy them. They always return. They will always return." He was right. Miriam had burned both objects multiple times. They'd always come back. As long as Josiah's spirit existed, as long as his rage remained, the portrait and photograph would regenerate. His curse was bound to them, but they were also bound to him. I looked at the pages from Margaret Hale's grimoire. There, in the margins, was a note I hadn't noticed before, written in pencil in Abigail's handwriting. If the binding fails, if he escapes, the only way to truly stop him is to give him what he wants. Let him claim what he believes is his. Let him take it all, and then seal him inside it forever. Give him what he wants. I understood suddenly. Josiah wanted the house, wanted to own it, to possess it, to make everything within its walls his eternal domain. He'd been trapped outside his own life for 44 years, watching but unable to participate. And when the binding broke, he'd finally been able to act. But only through the photograph, only by trapping others the way he'd been trapped. If I let him claim the house completely, if I let him pour all of his essence into possessing this space, he would become inseparable from it. And then, "You want the house?" I said, still holding the pages. "Fine, take it. Take every board, every nail, every stone. Make it yours completely." Josiah's expression changed. Suspicion flickered across his face. "What trick is this?" "No trick. I'm offering you what you've always wanted. Full possession, complete ownership. Every spirit that was ever trapped here will be yours to command. The house will be your domain, your kingdom, your eternal territory." I could see him considering it, see the hunger in his eyes. He wanted it so badly, wanted to finally, fully claim what had been denied him for so long. "But," I continued, pulling an iron nail from my pocket, "if you accept, you can never leave. You will be bound to this house for eternity. You will have your domain, but you will never expand beyond it. And the moment this house falls, the moment it's torn down or burns or crumbles with age, you will fall with it." "The house will never fall," Josiah said. "I will sustain it. I will keep it standing forever." "Then we have an agreement." I spoke the final words of the binding ritual, not to trap him outside the house, but to seal him inside it, to make the walls themselves his prison. As I spoke, I drove the iron nail into the floor. into the exact spot where Abigail had buried her binding materials 142 years ago. Josiah screamed as the magic took hold. His form began to dissolve, to spread outward, to sink into the walls and floors and ceiling. The portrait on the wall blazed with sudden light, and I could see his image changing. No longer a simple painted figure, but something alive and aware and trapped within the canvas. The photograph on the desk burst into flames. Not normal fire, a cold, blue flame that didn't consume the paper, but burned away the images captured there. One by one, the 16 faces faded. And as they disappeared from the photograph, they appeared in the room. The Whitmore family, all 16 of them, standing in a circle around the desk. Solid now, real, free. Martha stepped forward, her hand no longer pressed to her burned chest. She looked younger than in the photograph, healthier, the weight of death lifted from her features. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "We've been trapped for so long, watching as he used us, fed on us, kept us tethered to his rage." "What will happen to him?" I asked, looking at the portrait where Josiah's painted eyes now blazed with impotent fury. "He will remain," Martha said, "bound to this house, unable to leave, unable to touch anyone beyond its walls. As long as the house stands, he will be trapped within it, and when the house finally falls," she smiled sadly, "he will fall with it." One by one, the Whitmore family members began to fade, not disappearing into the photograph this time, but moving on. Thomas nodded to me as he vanished. Catherine smiled. The two girls in the front row, Rebecca and Emily, held hands as they dissolved into light. Martha was the last to go. "Tear it down," she said. "Don't let anyone else live here. Don't let him have even that small victory. Tear it down and salt the earth and let him rage in the ruins." And then she was gone. I stood alone in the study, breathing hard, my hands shaking. The portrait still hung on the wall, Josiah's image frozen in eternal fury. The photograph had turned to ash, leaving only the iron nails on the desk. I picked up my phone and called Davis. "I need you to bring your crew," I said. "I'm tearing down the house, all of it, and I need you to start today." The demolition took 3 weeks. I stood across the street and watched as the wrecking crew reduced 47 Essex Street to rubble. They saved nothing. Every board, every stone, every piece of material that had been part of that house was destroyed. When they reached the study, the last room to fall, I could have sworn I heard a scream carried on the wind. But maybe it was just the groan of old wood finally giving way. When the site was cleared, I had them dig down 6 feet, removing even the foundation. Then I salted the earth, just as Martha had asked. They paved it over with concrete and asphalt, turning the lot into a small parking area for the neighboring businesses. The portrait was the last thing to go. I took it to Patricia at the Historical Society, and together we locked it in a steel box lined with iron and salt. We buried the box in the archives, in a room that required 3 keys to access, and we agreed that it should never be displayed, never be photographed, never be allowed into the light. Sometimes I wonder if he's still aware in there, trapped in paint and canvas, screaming silently in his painted prison. I wonder if consciousness persists in that kind of binding, or if it's more like sleep, endless, dreamless sleep. I hope he's aware. I hope every second feels like an eternity. I hope he remembers the 16 people he destroyed, the families he terrorized, the century of cruelty he inflicted on anyone who dared to enter what he claimed as his domain. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. Patricia retired 6 months after we sealed the portrait. She moved to Vermont, far from Salem, far from the Historical Society and its collection of cursed objects and dark histories. She calls me sometimes, late at night, and we don't talk about what happened. We just check in, make sure the other is still okay. Still sleeping without nightmares of 16 screaming faces. I kept my great-aunt Miriam's journals. I read them sometimes, understanding now what she went through. 60 years of vigilance, 60 years of keeping the portrait and photograph separated. 60 years of living in a house she knew was cursed, but refusing to abandon because she understood that someone had to stand guard. She was braver than I could ever be. In her final journal entry, written the week before she died, she wrote, "I am tired, so very tired. I've fought for 60 years to keep Josiah contained, to protect the souls he trapped, to prevent anyone else from suffering as the Whitmores did. But I am old now, and I can feel my strength failing. I've sealed the photograph one last time. Perhaps whoever inherits this house will be wiser than I was. Perhaps they will find a way to end this curse permanently. Or perhaps they will simply tear the house down and be done with it. Either way, my watch is ending. I can only pray that the next guardian is strong enough to finish what I could not. I like to think I honored her hope. I like to think that somewhere, Miriam knows that her 60 years of vigilance weren't in vain, that the curse is finally ended, that the Whitmore family is finally free. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I drive past the parking lot that used to be 47 Essex Street. It's just asphalt and painted lines now, cars coming and going, people walking past without knowing what once stood there, without knowing about the 16 souls trapped in a photograph, the Confederate captain bound by his wife's desperate magic, the great-aunt who fought a silent war for 6 decades. The past stays buried, the dead stay silent, and the house that contained so much darkness is gone, reduced to rubble and memory, and a story I'll never tell anyone except Patricia late at night, when the darkness presses too close, and we need to remind each other that we survived. I still have the photograph from that first day, the one I took with my phone before everything went wrong. Sometimes I look at it, at those 16 faces frozen in 1907, at the military portrait watching from the wall behind them, and I remind myself that they're free now, that they're not trapped anymore, that sometimes the only way to end a haunting is to destroy the place that holds it. The house is gone, the portrait is sealed, the photograph is ash, and somewhere, I hope, 16 souls rest in peace at last, free from the rage of a man who refused to let go of his cruelty even in death. As for Josiah Whitmore, captain of the Confederacy, husband of Abigail, father who was never allowed to terrorize his daughter, he remains in his canvas prison, deep in the archives of the Salem Historical Society, behind locked doors and iron bindings, screaming silently into eternity. May he never be released. May his portrait never see light. May his name be forgotten by all but those who need to remember why some doors should stay closed, some walls should stay sealed, and some photographs should never be found. The end came not with fire or fury, but with concrete and salt, and the simple act of refusing to let evil have its way. And that, I think, is enough.